as we know, within Marxism, there is this kind of vague idea of the base and the superstructure, right? Here is the superstructure and here is the base, right? So typically people, position these correctly. And then classical Marxism comprehends that these are interrelated, yada, yada, dialectically, right? Even though the base has a primary significance, the superstructure also helps in determining the form of the base, right? So this is the very simplistic understanding that comes from classical Marxism. Now, I will explain that in Leninism, a new contribution to Marxism is made that doesn't contradict classical Marxism, but rather elaborates upon it in ways that made classical Marxist dogmatists and the social democrat orthodox Marxists very uncomfortable. Lenin actually started to comprehend that there is an antagonism between the superstructure and base as well. That at the level of this contradiction right here, there was actually a contradiction, such that it's not just this. It's almost like at the level of the base, there are other inceptual possibilities of other superstructures constantly being endangered, in terms of their potentiality. And that the structure, instead of just being a superstructure, if it's an apparatus of class control, has to evolve into being this hegemony, which is a notion that was elaborated by Antonio Gramsci. And a hegemony, it's like above, in a way, the superstructure itself. And a hegemony suppresses all of these inceptual, alternative possible superstructures. So this is why Lenin he's the theorist of imperialism, because within classical Marxism, an imperial principle is not really recognized in general. Only the bourgeois republican principle. That's the typical superstructure that just directly reflects the capitalist base. And so in classical Marxism, you just have a kind of one dimension of contradiction, which is right here, right? But Lenin, he introduces something on top of this scheme, which is hegemony. Now, if there's hegemony, there is also correspondingly a kind of, let's just call it democratic populism. It's a kind of Sophianic principle that was a vestige of the influence of the Narod movement in Russia, which Lenin and all the revolutionaries at the time took for granted in many ways. But for them, the kind of the dimension of the people's popular revolution was something that also was a principle that superseded this classical Marxist distinction, but from the opposite direction. So this is the base of guerrilla warfare that fights the imperial hegemony. So this is Hamas, and basically this is where Hamas is, and this is where Mao and the Popular Front in China was, and this is like Japan. And so in this schema, as applied to the Popular Front, Dimitrov and the theorists of the Popular Front in the 1930s basically said that to apply Leninist principles correctly, fascism was associated with this extra-republican, extra-constitutional, dictatorial, open dictatorship, right? That is threatening even the constitutional integrity of a bourgeois democratic republics, right? And that the only way to resist it is to go down, lower into the masses, and have this kind of democratic popular front that does indeed cut across class distinctions that exist within the base, to have a principle that can fight the hegemony, imperial hegemony, okay? Now, this is so crazy and schizophrenic, so we're just going to go back to the simple Marxist, classical Marxist thing of the superstructure and the base, so that no one loses their mind and gets a headache. But okay, let's understand clearly that in the base, you have a class contradiction, right? Let's just say the proletariat is a circle and the bourgeoisie is a square, right? I don't know if this seems like it reflects conflict, but there's like this contradiction in the base itself. And it was Lenin who pointed out that there are also, by the same logic, there's also a contradiction at the level of superstructure. And that is why above the bourgeois Republican superstructure, you have this imperial tendency. He describes that in the development of capitalism itself, culminating in imperialism. But imperialism was not just about the development of an economic system. It also referred to a tendency that was observed by Lenin during World War I, which is why he called World War I a reactionary war, where bourgeois democracy was being suspended with emergency powers, and there's this new imperial political tendency, which had already existed in Russia at the time. Because you understand, let me explain something. In Russia, the schema was this. This was the Duma, right? This was the autocracy. And then here you had distinction. And then below you had here the Russian peasantry. So I want you to understand this schema to simplify Marxism-Leninism, because you can actually be an Anglo-box guy, fit this in, and you can put many different kind of things here. So for example, instead of autocracy, you can have Japanese imperialism or Zionism or whatever, right? Here you can have some kind of sovereignty, traditional bourgeois sense of sovereignty. You have your typical class distinctions, and then you can have Hamas, the Chinese Popular Front, Anti-Fascist Popular Front, yada, 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 right? This schema is, instead of just the base superstructure one that comes from classical Marxism, you have this one in Marxism-Leninism, okay? Now, again, both of these are things that transcend the superstructure, the autocracy and the Russian peasantry, from opposite directions. The autocracy consolidates the superstructure. Everyone please follow me, okay? So let's do this, okay? Imperial principle consolidates superstructure, locks it in. Good. Let's make this short. It consolidates the superstructure and it locks it in, okay? The superstructure is, this is open terrain, democratic site of battle. Now here, let's just call this popular principle, permanent state of chaos that threatens every established superstructure, okay? For example, so this is that. Thank you so much for that. Highly volatile. Okay, here we are. All right. So this is not sufficiently clear. I understand that. But as you can see, both of these, in a way, transcend this distinction and give expression to its form. So this is a battle at the level of form, right? And this is the content. This base here, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, it's a fundamental class distinction. But the victory of the bourgeoisie leads to a specific kind of superstructure, which, in response to proletarian class antagonism, culminates in an imperial principle, right? This locks in the superstructure in favor of the bourgeoisie. So what Lenin does and what Mao does is the base is constantly being reproduced. Constant reproduction. The base is constantly being reproduced here, down below. It's constantly being reproduced. And I will cite something from Lenin to help that's from left-wing communism, an infantile disorder that will help actually understand this. So Lenin writes, for example, that the dictatorship of the proletariat means a war against the new class, against a more powerful enemy, the bourgeoisie, whose resistance is increased tenfold by their overthrow, whose power lies not only in the strength of international capital, the strength and durability of their international connections. So that Lenin right there, you see where he's talking about, that is a reference to the system of hegemonic imperialism, which is right here. This is the imperial principle. That is what he's talking about there. He talks about how, in addition to that, also the force of habit, the strength of small-scale production, and that he says small-scale production engenders capitalism and the bourgeoisie continually, daily, hourly, spontaneously, and on a mass scale. And that this is what makes the dictatorship of the proletariat necessary, and victory is not possible over the bourgeoisie without a long, stubborn, desperate struggle, which calls for tenacity, discipline, and single and inflexible will. So he's talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat and its necessity here. So let me go back to here, right? So what he just described, force of habit and small-scale production, and it's happening from below, and it's engendering newly and afresh, reproducing these relationships of production, hourly, daily, and so on. That is coming from the popular principle, right here, the highly volatile dimension of material existence, of an organic material, national, or social body, right? And this is the dimension of civil society and culture. So there are two axis under which you can understand the traditional base of capitalist production, right? One is the imperial principle that consolidates and locks in the specific and unique establishment of a bourgeoisie. It's a specific cartel, it's a specific monopoly, whatever, right? But then also, the base is constantly being reproduced at the level of relations within civil society. Okay. And that is the popular principle. That is the dimension of the people, where there is no clear class distinctions, where there is a vacillating mass that has proletarian tendencies. It has bourgeois tendencies. Just as Lenin was describing the peasantry in the development of capitalism in Russia, right? One of his earliest works. There is a ambiguity at this level. And why is that? Because institutionally, there is a kind of volatility and openness which constantly disturbs every imperial principle. Just like in Gaza, Hamas, it's disturbing the Zionist occupation and therefore disturbing the establishment of a very specific capitalist superstructure, right? Because from the people themselves, there's this resistance that's constantly being endangered. But it's not only resistance, as Lenin said, you could also say in a way, this is where the reproduction of society at a material level is actually happening. Now, the thing is that in Marxism, real historical changes happen here. This is the interesting thing. Within Marxism, the real changes in history are happening here, okay? Whereas here, in Marxism, forces that retard history exist here. So look how interesting this is. This is just Marxism-Leninism for you. All of the active and vital transformations that are subtly happening, the way in which from the logic of capitalism itself, new relations of production, of socialism are emerging, whatever that Marx describes. This is only happening at the organic material level of civil society, material relations of production that are a consequence of the force of habit. Just as Lenin said, the bourgeoisie is being reproduced hourly and daily and so on. That reproduction here accelerates transformation. It's movement, it's development. Reproduction is development. Something that reproduces according to dialectics also develops in a direction of change. But the imperial principle actually retards and halts and tries to freeze that reproduction. It tries to freeze that reproduction to lock it in, to maintain the hegemony of a single monopoly, a single establishment, and so on. A single hegemony, right? That's why the accelerationist position of unleashing capitalism and freeing it up from imperialist hegemony, like Deng Xiaoping in a way, the reason Marxists have this optimism that will lead to socialism is because of this idea that the imperial hegemony is retarding the development of history by locking in a specific institution of class dictatorship that is retarding the forces of production. Okay, ones if this makes sense, because it makes a lot of sense to me. This scheme is applicable on a lot of different levels. So look, it's really simple. There's also other ways I can explain this. Don't worry if you're overwhelmed by that and it's really hard. You can also think of things in terms of, let's just have a neutral shape. I don't know, an oval. In framing, right? In framing. I'll just put it this way. So here you have class contradictions. Here you have class contradiction, right? That's happening right here, right? But sometimes the superstructure takes the form of, for example, imperialism, Zionism, autocracy, fascism, you name it, right here. So sometimes this becomes a secondary contradiction, right? Sometimes this becomes a secondary contradiction, right? This is the whole people, right? And this becomes, let me just, I don't know, use green, I don't know, or red to emphasize antagonism. This, let me see, this becomes the primary contradiction. So this is another way to simplify it if the other way was too complicated for you. So there's a base and the superstructure, but sometimes the base unifies in a way because each base is national in form against a superstructure, an established and consolidated superstructure. So what is the example that Mao gives of this? Is Mao a fascist? We need to know from Brandon. But what does Mao say? So right here, he says, give me 1 second. Sorry. Okay, so here it is. So in a semi-colonial country, the relationship between principle and contradiction and non-principle presents a complicated picture. When imperialism launches war of aggression against such a country, all its various classes, except for some traitors, can temporarily unite in a national war against imperialism. That it's Mao talking about supposed class collaboration. Right? At such a time, the contradiction between imperialism and the country concerned becomes the principal contradiction. All the contradictions among the various different classes are temporarily relegated to a secondary and subordinate position. Okay, so this is what Mao says, right? Now, look at this diagram I made for you for free, by the way, right here. So again, this becomes the primary contradiction, and these contradictions within the people become secondary contradictions under these circumstances, right? That Mao describes, for example. But the interesting thing is that the logic doesn't confine itself to the context of a semi-colonial country, because this same logic is applied to anti-imperialism and the anti-fascist popular front. It's the same logic, it gets applied in different ways. And this is the essential distinguishing factor of Marxism, Leninism versus classical Marxism, okay?